78 years ago, a supermarine Spitfire crashed into the North Sea during a routine patrol over the English Channel. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant James Whitmore, ejected safely. The aircraft was recovered, catalogued, and filed away in an RAF storage facility in Hampshire. What made this particular Spitfire remarkable was not immediately obvious, not until 2019, when a structural engineer named Dr. Eleanor Hartley began examining archived aircraft for a documentary on wartime manufacturing efficiency. She noticed something impossible. The wing panels bore a rivet pattern that should not have existed in 1942. The spacing was too uniform. The depth of each rivet head was consistent to within fractions of a millimeter. Under magnification, the pattern revealed a mathematical precision that contradicted everything known about hand riveting during wartime production. Factory girls working 12-hour shifts on production lines did not produce this kind of accuracy. Machines did. But the Spitfires of that era were riveted almost entirely by hand. Eleanor filed a formal inquiry with the RAF Historical Commission. The response came 6 months later. No record exists of this aircraft's manufacturing origin or assembly line assignment. The serial numbers had been cross-referenced. The factory designation had vanished from all ledgers. It was as though the plane had been built in shadow by hands that left no paper trail. Within weeks, Eleanor discovered she was not the first to notice. A retired factory inspector named William Cross, now 93 years old and living in a care home in Coventry, had documented the same anomaly in 1987. His personal journal, discovered by his daughter, contained sketches, measurements, and a single name, Margaret Hollins. Margaret had worked the riveting line at the Castle Bromwich Spitfire factory during 1942. According to Cross's notes, she had developed a rivet pattern that reduced assembly time from 20 hours to 2. The pattern was revolutionary. It was also never officially recorded. Margaret had vanished from the factory payroll in September 1942, and no pension record, no employment history, and no trace of her existed in any government archive. Eleanor made the decision to search for her. The Castle Bromwich factory operated under conditions of controlled chaos. Built in 1938 as a shadow factory, a dispersed manufacturing facility designed to survive enemy bombing, it employed over 5,000 workers by 1942, most of them women aged 18 to 40. They were called Spitfire Girls, though the name carried little romance. The work was repetitive, dangerous, and relentless. A single Spitfire fuselage required approximately 20 Suzanne rivets. Each rivet had to be heated, inserted, and secured by hand. A factory girl working the riveting line could complete roughly 1 wing panel per shift. The process involved heating the rivet in a forge, carrying it in a ceramic cup to the assembly station, inserting it through pre-drilled holes in the aluminum skin, and then bucking it, striking the protruding end with a pneumatic gun, while a colleague held a dolly against the opposite side to form the permanent joint. The work destroyed hands. It deafened ears. Women wore protective gear designed decades before, leather aprons, canvas gloves, goggles that fogged in the heat. Many developed chronic respiratory conditions from metal dust and the fumes of cutting fluids. Margaret Hollins arrived at Castle Bromwich in March 1942, transferred from the Nuffield automotive plant in Birmingham. Her personnel file, later recovered by Eleanor in the Coventry archives, listed her as a general assembly operative with no specialized training. Her previous work experience involved riveting car door panels. Precision was not the primary concern in automotive manufacture. By June 1942, factory supervisor reports began to note anomalies. Certain wing panels completed by Margaret were arriving at final inspection with flawless rivet patterns and accelerated completion times. Initially, inspectors suspected falsified records, that the panels were actually completed by senior workers or brought in from other facilities. but the serial numbers matched. The panels bore Margaret's distinctive tool marks. The metal showed consistent aging and oxidation patterns with the rest of the production batch. William Cross, then a junior inspector at age 32, was assigned to investigate. His journal entries from July 1942 describe his first observation. Observed Operative Hollins at Station 14. She was completing a port wing root panel in approximately 110 minutes. Standard time, 200 minutes. Her rivet pattern was geometric in precision, spacing perfect, depth consistent. I timed each rivet insertion. She was not working faster, she was working differently. The rivet sequence followed a load distribution pattern I had never encountered. When I asked her method, she said, "It's just where they want to go, Mr. Cross. The metal tells you." Cross began documenting her work daily. Within 3 weeks, he had recorded 7 different wing panels, each completed in 2 to 3 hours, each bearing identical structural precision. He calculated that if Margaret's method could be systematized and taught to other factory girls, Spitfire production could triple. He submitted a formal recommendation to the factory superintendent, Dr. Ernest Hives, who oversaw all supermarine facilities for the war effort. Hives's response arrived within 48 hours. Margaret Hollins was to cease all current work. She was to be transferred to a secure section of the factory, designated Special Projects Restricted Access. Her wages would increase from 9 shillings per week to 15 shillings. She was not to discuss her work with any other operative. All documentation regarding her methods was to be classified. 3 weeks later, Margaret was gone. On September 12, 1942, Margaret Hollins collected her final wages and walked out of Castle Bromwich. No exit interview was recorded. No forwarding address was filed. She simply ceased to exist in the factory's records. William Cross attempted to locate her through the local employment exchange. She had not registered for reassignment. She had not filed for transfer to another factory. She had not volunteered for military service. Eleanor discovered the break in the narrative through a chance discovery. A letter from Cross's widow, dated 1998, in response to an Historical Society inquiry. The letter stated, "My husband always believed Margaret Hollins was moved to a classified facility. He never confirmed this. But in his final years, he mentioned meeting someone from the Air Ministry who visited the factory in August 1942. After Margaret disappeared, he never spoke of it again." This reference sparked a new avenue of investigation. Eleanor contacted the National Archives in Kew, specifically the Air Ministry Historical Section. After months of requests and bureaucratic delays, she received permission to examine declassified files related to aircraft manufacturing, technical innovation, 1942-1945. Among 3,000 pages of memoranda, she found a single document, a transfer order dated September 10, 1942, signed by Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding himself. The order referred to Operative MH, Specialized Manufacturing Techniques, transferred to Farnborough Research Station for technical evaluation and methodology documentation. Farnborough, the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the heart of British aeronautical innovation and the most secretive facility in the RAF network during wartime. Margaret Hollins had been transferred not to produce more Spitfires, but to explain how she produced them and to teach others. Eleanor filed a new request for Farnborough records. The response took 8 months. When it arrived, the file was almost empty, 63 pages heavily redacted, with only fragments visible. One passage remained legible. Operative Hollins demonstrated load distribution rivet sequencing, reducing assembly time by 90%. Method based on intuitive understanding of stress vectors and metal fatigue properties. Attempts to systematize methodology proved unsuccessful. Operative reports method operates on sensory input rather than mathematical formula. unable to reproduce results with trained engineers, recommend continued assignment for direct production application. Another entry, dated December 1942. Operative Hollins assigned to classified production facility, location withheld, project codename redacted, duration indefinite. And then silence. Nothing. No further mention. No record of her employment, her location, or her fate after December 1942. Eleanor began to wonder if Margaret had ever left that facility, or if the war, and the decades of silence that followed, had simply swallowed her whole. In 2020, Eleanor's documentary on wartime manufacturing anomalies aired on the BBC. The episode featuring the mysterious Spitfire and Margaret Hollins's Rivet pattern reached nearly 3 million viewers. Within 3 days, she received an email from a woman named Dorothy Ashford, then 94 years old, living in a retirement community in Surrey. The subject line read, "I knew her." Dorothy had worked as a secretary at Farnborough Research Station from 1940 to 1945. She had direct access to the records office, where classified project files were maintained. She had never spoken publicly about her work due to the Official Secrets Act, an obligation that technically remained binding even after 75 years. But Dorothy was dying. She had weeks, perhaps days, and she wanted the truth told. Eleanor visited her on a cold February morning. Dorothy was frail, her hands trembling, but her mind was sharp. She spoke in measured tones, choosing each word carefully, as though the words themselves still carried classified weight. Margaret Hollins arrived at Farnborough in September 1942, Dorothy began. I processed her intake documentation. She was assigned to what we called the Advanced Methodology Project, essentially a classified unit tasked with reverse engineering and systematizing her rivet technique. The Air Ministry believed that if they could understand her method mathematically, they could teach it to factory workers across all production facilities. Imagine reducing assembly time from 20 hours to 2 hours across hundreds of factories. It would have multiplied aircraft production exponentially. Did they succeed? Eleanor asked. Dorothy shook her head slowly. Margaret couldn't explain it, and that was the tragedy. She didn't understand her own gift. When engineers asked her how she determined rivet placement and sequence, she would say things like, "The metal showed me," or "I just felt where they needed to go." The engineers called her delusional. They ran psychological evaluations. They tested her IQ, her spatial reasoning, her motor skills. Everything was normal. Exceptional, but normal. She wasn't superhuman. She was just intuitive in a way they couldn't measure or replicate. What happened to her? Eleanor pressed. Dorothy closed her eyes. By late 1943, the project was deemed a failure. Margaret's technique couldn't be systematized, couldn't be taught, couldn't be scaled. The decision was made to return her to regular factory production, but not at Castle Bromwich. She was transferred to a dispersed manufacturing facility in North Wales, a secret Spitfire assembly plant. She worked there until 1945, always isolated, always under observation, but essentially invisible. After the war ended, she received a small pension, not as a worker, but as part of a confidentiality settlement. She signed documents stating she would never speak about her work. She lived quietly. She died in 1987. Eleanor felt the weight of the revelation. Do you know where she's buried? St. Michael's Church, in a village called Llanfair Pwllgwyngyl in Wales. Small headstone, her name and dates only. No inscription, no recognition of what she did. Dorothy died 4 days later. Eleanor travelled to Wales and found the grave. The stone was indeed unmarked except for name and dates. Margaret Ellen Hollins, 1921-1987. 66 years of life, 23 years working with metal and precision, 44 years of silence. Eleanor placed flowers on the grave and stood in the cold Welsh wind. She thought about the Spitfires that Margaret's hands had touched. She thought about the pilots who flew those aircraft into battle, never knowing that their wings bore the mark of a factory girl whose genius had been deemed unsystematizable, therefore worthless to preserve. Chapter 5. The Silent Legacy, Extended Version. Today, Margaret Hollins exists only in fragments. A redacted file at Farnborough, a mention in William Cross's journal, a grave in Wales, and now in archival records finally made public through historical research, a name that belongs to no official narrative. The Spitfire that Eleanor discovered in 2019, the one bearing the impossible rivet pattern, underwent 18 months of structural analysis before its significance could be fully documented. The aircraft had suffered minor damage to the fuselage during its water landing, but the wings remained intact. The rivets themselves showed no signs of fatigue, corrosion, or stress fractures, despite 77 years of exposure to salt water, temperature fluctuations, and the natural degradation that claimed most recovered warbirds. Metallurgical testing revealed that the joints had been sealed with precision riveting techniques that modern analysis struggled to replicate without computer-assisted guidance systems. The RAF Museum at Cosford accepted the restored Spitfire in 2021. During the installation ceremony, Dr. Eleanor Hartley stood beside the aircraft and read aloud from the museum's commissioned plaque. Supermarine Spitfire, Michele Key, registration JX347, recovered from the North Sea, 2019. Represents exemplary wartime manufacturing standards and engineering precision characteristic of Castle Bromwich Production Facility, 1942. Pilot, Flight Lieutenant James Whitmore, RAF 66 Squadron. The plaque makes no mention of Margaret Hollins. It cannot. The official connection remains unconfirmed by any surviving documentation. The transfer order from Dowding has been declassified, but Farnborough's classified project files remain sealed under national security provisions that extend into the 2040s. The truth, as Eleanor discovered, exists in the spaces between documents, in absences rather than assertions. Yet her work persists, visible to anyone willing to examine it closely. Modern aeronautical engineers who have studied photographs and technical drawings of Margaret's rivet patterns note that they reflect principles of load distribution that wouldn't be formally theorized and standardized until the 1950s and 1960s, a decade or more after Margaret had intuitively implemented them on production lines. She had understood, through touch and sensory intuition, the relationship between rivet spacing, metal fatigue, stress vectors, and aerodynamic integrity. She had solved engineering problems that required advanced mathematics to explain, problems that would eventually consume thousands of hours of doctoral research and computational analysis. Dr. Adrian Foster, a structural engineer at Imperial College London, examined Eleanor's documentation in 2022. His assessment was stark. If we reverse engineer the load distribution pattern she used, we find principles that align with Castigliano's theorem and advanced finite element analysis. She was applying theoretical mechanics intuitively. That shouldn't have been possible, but it was, which means Margaret Hollins possessed either extraordinary mathematical intuition, or she had access to information we don't have in the record. Either way, her work was decades ahead of contemporary engineering knowledge. The tragedy is not that Margaret was forgotten. The tragedy is that she was never truly known, not even to those who held her fate in their hands. During her 18 months at Farnborough, Margaret was subjected to repeated psychological evaluations, interviewed by engineers attempting to extract systematic principles from intuitive knowledge, and observed as though she were an anomaly of nature rather than a human being with expertise. The declassified fragments reveal clinical language. Subject demonstrates non-verbal spatial reasoning. Methodology appears to operate outside conscious articulation. Attempts to communicate procedural knowledge through verbal description prove unsuccessful. One redacted memorandum, partially legible, contains a passage that haunted Eleanor when she first read it. Subject claims to hear the metal. When asked to clarify, subject became evasive. Psychological evaluation suggests possible auditory hallucination or metaphorical language interpreted literally by subject. Recommend further investigation into neurological basis for claimed sensory input. Margaret was never given the language to explain herself. The men around her were looking for mathematical formulas, reproducible systems, teachable methods. What they encountered instead was embodied knowledge, skill that lived in hands, in muscle memory, in sensory perception, honed through repetitive practice and intuitive understanding. It was knowledge that the machinery of wartime production couldn't digest, couldn't systematize, couldn't control. In a war driven by standardization, efficiency matrices, and reproducible systems, Margaret Hollins was an anomaly that defied categorization. She couldn't be measured, she couldn't be replicated, she couldn't be scaled across production facilities in the manner the Air Ministry had hoped. Therefore, to the bureaucratic apparatus of wartime manufacturing, she became expendable, or rather, she became confined. She was transferred to isolated production facilities where her work could continue, but her presence could be contained, monitored, and ultimately erased from institutional memory. After the war, Margaret lived quietly in North Wales. She worked various small jobs, never in aircraft manufacturing again, never in any role that required explanation or documentation of her extraordinary abilities. She received a small pension, paid through a confidentiality arrangement in exchange for her silence. The document she signed bound her by law and threat of legal action from speaking about her work, her methods, her years at Farnborough, or her experiences in the classified production facility where she had spent the final years of the war. She died in 1987, 66 years old, with her knowledge dying alongside her. Eleanor's research uncovered that Margaret had written letters during her time at Farnborough, letters to her mother, now deceased. A cousin discovered the letters in a storage box after Margaret's death and held them for decades. Uncertain of their significance, Eleanor was permitted to read them. They were never published, protected by family privacy, but Eleanor's notes capture fragments. One letter, dated November 1942. They ask me to explain things I don't know how to explain. When I place a rivet, I know where it should go. The metal seems to suggest it. But when I try to tell them this, they write things down as though I'm speaking nonsense. Perhaps I am. Perhaps I should simply do the work and say nothing. Another, from March 1943. An engineer stayed with me all day, watching me work. He asked me to slow down and describe each step. But I cannot slow down. If I think about it, my hands become uncertain. The work only flows when I don't think. When I think, it breaks. I don't know what they want from me. Eleanor placed flowers on Margaret's grave on a cold November afternoon in 2023. The headstone bore only the basics. Margaret Ellen Hollins, 1921-1987. No inscription, no epitaph, no recognition of what those hands had accomplished, what that mind had intuitively understood, what that brief, brilliant period of her life had meant. Eleanor stood in the Welsh wind and thought about the Spitfires that Margaret's hands had touched. She thought about the pilots who flew those aircraft into battle over the Channel, over France, over Germany, pilots who would never know that their wings bore the mark of a factory girl whose genius had been deemed unsystematizable, therefore unworthy of preservation or public acknowledgement. Those pilots lived or died, returned home, or crashed into water or fell to enemy fire, but the precision of their aircraft carried forward, invisible and unattributed, the silent legacy of a woman whose name had been systematically erased from the narrative of her own achievement. The Spitfires still fly, in museums, in photographs, in historical records and documentaries, and the collective memory of wartime innovation. And somewhere in the precision of their construction, in the geometry of their joints, in the structural integrity that allowed them to survive combat and decades of recovery, Margaret's hands remain. The aero engine may have been forged by named engineers whose contributions were recorded and celebrated. The airframe may have been designed by famous aircraft designers whose names appear in every history of aviation. The strategies and tactics may have been determined by commanding officers whose decisions shaped the war itself. But it was held aloft, all of it, by the intuitive genius of a factory girl who understood metal the way poets understand language. Through feeling, through listening, through a knowledge that transcends words and systematic explanation. She was paid 9 shillings per week. She was never credited in official records. She was silenced by legal agreement and historical erasure. And yet her work persisted, visible to anyone willing to look closely enough, carried forward in the precision of riveted joints, in the strength of wings that bore the weight of history. The war ended in 1945. The factories closed. The files were sealed. The secrets were classified. And Margaret returned to obscurity, her gift untaught, her method lost, her name removed from every official narrative as thoroughly as though she had never existed at all. But the metal remembers. The precision of those joints speaks across the decades. The structural integrity that saved lives in wartime continues to teach lessons to modern engineers who study her work without knowing her name. The Spitfire in the museum at Cosford bears witness, silent witness, unattributed witness, but witness nonetheless, to the hands that shaped it with knowledge that transcended explanation. The war ended, but the metal remembers. And perhaps in the end, that is the only memorial Margaret Hollins will ever receive. Not a plaque with her name, not a public acknowledgement, not a place in the official history of wartime manufacturing, but the persistent, invisible presence of her work, carried forward in the precision of riveted joints, in the strength of aluminum skin, in the geometry of wings that once touched the sky and 77 years later still spoke to anyone willing to listen. The factory girl who accelerated production. The woman whose hands understood what mathematics could not yet express. The genius who was silenced not by enemy action, but by the simple incomprehension of those who held power over her fate. She lives now only in fragments, a grave, a redacted file, a Spitfire in a museum, and in the memory of one researcher who refused to let her story disappear entirely. This is her legacy. This is all that remains, and it is perhaps enough. Would you like me to adjust any specific sections or expand further on particular elements?